Today we pick up with Reformation ideas spread as they are spreading from not only Germany with Martin Luther and Geneva with John Calvin, but to other groups. Like I said, other groups are going to begin thinking about protesting against the Catholic Church. And so we're going to see how those ideas begin to spread throughout Europe. There are some radical reformers, and radical are those that are kind of out there. They don't tend to have a whole lot of followers, but they are also trying to reform the church. So we're going to see hundreds of new sects or divisions, and sects is S-E-C-T-S, but they're going to spring up, and each one seems just to be more radical than the next. So they come up with even more far out ideas of how they want to change the church and make it different. So some of them are going to reject things like infant baptism. They felt that children were too young to understand what it meant to really accept the Christian faith, and so they felt that baptism really should only be for adults. And this is a group called the Anabaptists, that they felt baptism should happen when you are an adult and you are making that choice, that decision to embrace the Christian religion. Others are going to say, well, we need to speed up the coming of God's day of judgment. And if we have to do that by violence, if necessary, if that's what's needed to get the day of judgment to come, so that way then Jesus can win and reign on earth for 1,000 years or whatever, that's what we're going to do. So there's some that are going to try and do that. Others are going to preach religious tolerance and the separation of church and state, that the church and the government should not be intermingled. So, like I said, lots of different ideas coming out of this Reformation period. Then we have the English, and the English are going to have a whole separate way of reforming the Catholic Church. And their final break from the Catholic Church is going to come with Henry VIII, King Henry VIII. Henry VIII is going to want to end the Pope's control over the English Church. At first, Henry was actually against any Protestant reform, and the Pope had called him a defender of the faith, that here was a guy who was sticking with the Catholic Church, and so he is labeled as the defender of the faith. However, it's Henry's marriage that is going to cause him some problems. Henry had been married for 18 years to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. She was a few years older than him, and so he had been married to her since his early teens, or in his teens, and they had only had one child who was still living. They had had multiple children together, but none of them survived. None of them lived except for Mary Tudor. That is the one child from their marriage. She's not a boy, and that's a problem for Henry because he wants a male heir. He wants to have a son to inherit after him. Nobody wants a woman on the throne, so he needs to get a son. Well, by this time, Catherine of Aragon is a little too old to be having any more children, and so Henry decides, well, he needs to remarry. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't give divorces, especially to the royalty. So it's kind of like not really forbidden, but highly not recommended thing to do is get a divorce. So Henry says, fine, you're not going to give me a divorce. Can you give me an annulment? And an annulment is going to cancel the marriage, like the marriage never existed to begin with. And the Pope is going to refuse to grant his annulment, mostly because the Holy Roman Emperor, who is closely tied with the Pope, is Catherine's nephew. And so the Pope doesn't want the Holy Roman Emperor to be mad at him, to be mad at the church, and to break away from the church, so he refuses to grant this annulment. Well, the reason Catherine's against the annulment is that if this marriage never happened, never existed, then first off, her child Mary is going to be labeled as a bastard, that she's an illegitimate child. Secondly, that Catherine was basically a whore because she's been living in sin without marriage, without the benefit of marriage, with this man for 18 years and had a child with him. And so nobody's going to do that to their own reputation willingly. And so she is going to act against him and basically say, I don't want this annulment. And she writes to her nephew, and her nephew puts pressure on the Pope, and the Pope says, no, not going to annul the marriage. So here's poor Henry, wants a son, can't get one. So his course of action, first he's going to, number one, stir up the public against the Pope, basically saying, look what the Pope is doing. He is preventing your future king from being born and taking over your country. The second is that he's going to take over the English church. He's just going to basically say, you don't need a Pope, all you need is me. You just need me, Henry VIII, to be in charge of the church, and that's all you really need. So he is going to have Parliament, the legislative body, take away the Pope's power over the church and give that to Henry. It's called the Act of Supremacy, where the king is the only head on earth of the Church of England. The Pope is not. So no more Pope. So it breaks away from the Catholic Church. Henry is then going to appoint a new archbishop, because he can do that. He's the head of the church now. And the new archbishop is going to be the one who says, yes, I annul your marriage. It no longer existed. It no longer exists. It's not going to be around. Henry, in the meantime, has been scouting out for some lucky ladies to become his next queen, and he marries a girl named Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn actually had been Catherine's lady-in-waiting, so they had a somewhat close relationship. And he marries Anne Boleyn. And thinking, oh, she's going to get pregnant right away because she's young and I like her. So she's going to get pregnant and we're going to have all kinds of boys and all kinds of stuff. Well, Anne gives birth to a daughter, his second daughter, Elizabeth. Eventually, he finds out that she was kind of cheating on him, and he has her beheaded. So now he doesn't even have to ask for a divorce, he just kills her. Henry is going to remarry 4 times more in his search for a son. He will marry Jane Seymour, he will marry Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. And of all these women, only one of them gives him a son, and that is Jane Seymour, and she gives him a son, Edward. And we'll learn more about them in class. But anyway, so she gives him a son, Edward. Well, Edward eventually will become king of England, but he also dies very, very early on. He dies in his teens, so he's not king for very long, which means that he's left with the 2 daughters to take over. But like I said, he did make some major changes to the Church of England. The Church of England, Henry is going to shut down all of the convents and monasteries in England and seize their lands. That basically gives him more power and more money to the throne. So he has, more power than he had to begin with. But he renames the church as the Anglican Church. And the Anglican Church is going to gain a lot of support from his nobles that, hey, this is okay that you're doing this. We're okay with that. And he does that by saying, if you back me on this, I will make sure that you get a part of the profit. Basically, we're going to share in the wealth. And the only difference really between like Lutherans and Calvinists and the Anglican Church is that how much they change the church, how much difference it's going to be. Well, in the Anglican Church, it's really not a radical change. In fact, it's basically a Catholic church with a few things missing. That's it. They keep most of the Catholic forms of worship of the prayer service and the Mass and baptism and confession and all that kind of stuff. It's all right there. He doesn't really change a whole lot. So, like I said, after Henry dies, Edward is going to take over, his son, and it's Edward VI, and Edward is 10 years old when Henry dies, and so that's when he becomes king, is at 10. And he's going to be dominated by the Protestants around him who wanted to bring in the Calvinist church or the Calvinist reforms. And so, he got this 10-year-old kid who really doesn't know what he wants to do, hasn't really lived his life yet, and now he's got to make major decisions involving religion in his country. Edward eventually, he never really had really great health, and so he dies while he's in his teens. And it's going to be his sister who is going to take over after him. And his sister is Mary Tudor, the older daughter, and she inherits. Now, it's interesting because Mary, as the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Aragon is in Spain, and the Spanish people are Catholic. And so Mary Tudor is Catholic, and she's a very pious Catholic, which means she is very devout. She is very, very Catholic. But she is determined to make England Catholic again instead of Protestant. Now, she's going to fail in this endeavor, but hundreds of Protestants are going to die at the stake in the meantime, and so that's how she gains her nickname of Bloody Mary, because so many people died while she was in power. Eventually, Mary also is going to die, and her half-sister Elizabeth becomes queen, and she'll become Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth, as the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was a Protestant. And so she is going to bring back unity to England, and England becomes very firmly a Protestant state. Even though it's not Lutheran and it's not Calvinist, it is still a Protestant because it breaks away from the Catholic Church. It's not Catholic. So she is going to be the head of the Anglican Church.